Thank you so much. And thank you to all those who are gathered here today. I want to begin by giving thanks for this earth, her creatures, her waters, her precious atmosphere and land, all of which support our life and all of life. I live on the unceded territories of the Tewa and in the greater watershed of the Rio Grande, or in Tewa it's called Posoge. And I'm talking to you from the studio of the great environmental writer William Du Bois. Bill lives in a small Mexican village called El Valle. That's at about an altitude of 8,000 feet, and it's right next to millions of acres of national forest. And I'm going to hold up Bill's book. This is his latest book. It's called The Trail to Kanjiroba, Rediscovering Earth in an Age of Loss. An extraordinary book. And we're a little bit featured in it because Bill and I and clinicians went to Dolpo. I was supposed to go with my old friend, Peter Matheson. Peter left this earth. So I turned toward Dolpo, carrying Peter in my heart, and with our medical team that works in high altitude areas, and we've been serving there now for many years. So I want to say that I stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and people of color, and I also want us to acknowledge those who are fleeing war and the effects of the climate catastrophe. And these people will disproportionately bear the burden of climate devastation. And I offer gratitude to social and environmental activists, to the scientists and governments working on understanding how to dial down this climate catastrophe, and most of all to earth-cherishing peoples, and also the young, who are taking a stand in relation to protecting and restoring health to our Mother Earth, and calling out corporate, political, and institutional greed and exploitation. And I also offer thanks to all of you here who've gathered to learn, to foster community, to take a stand together. I stand in solidarity with you, as every one of us will be affected by this unfolding climate catastrophe. And we all are aware that the calamitous changes in our climate are related to the terrible suffering associated with injustice, inequity, our exploitative economic structures, and have an incredible impact on the rights and well-being of all humans and of most species on our Earth. So it's important to know where you are right now. And so I'm going to ask if you would put into the chat stream the watershed that you're in at this very moment. Potomac, Hohokam, Huron, Fraser River, London, Chesapeake Bay, American River, Truckee, Connecticut River, Missouri, San Francisco Bay, Puget Sound, Danube, beautiful, Mystic River, Cape Fear, and if you know the name of the earth-cherishing peoples who occupied the land where you are now, you can also put those names in. Miwok, Beverly Lake, Uig, Abenaki, Humber River, Lenape, Salish Seas, Colorado River, and just flying through. Wonderful Mohawk. Okay, thank you. I thank you. I see, many parts of our earth shining through the names that you've offered. And I'm so grateful that you know the watershed that you're in. The devastating shifts in climate are a source, I believe, of profound moral suffering for so many of us. And I look at the climate catastrophe as a kind of breeder of moral disease or dis-ease. I believe that we need to look deeply at the effects on us of moral suffering in relation to the exploitation and also the destruction of our earth and the pollution of our atmosphere, and also the colonization of lands and the destruction of cultures and lifeways that have for thousands of years understood the ecologies in which they have dwelled. It's to understand that moral suffering is the harm that we experience in relation to actions that transgress our tenets of basic goodness. And I believe that Buddhism gives us a very valuable way to understand the experience of moral suffering. And this is it. When we, as individuals, or as a nation, or when we're part of institutions or corporations that cause suffering to other beings or ourselves, our integrity is compromised. And moral suffering is the outcome, whether we know it or not. And when we alleviate the suffering of others, our integrity is affirmed. And our character is fundamentally strengthened. So we can ask, what does it mean to have integrity? To have integrity is to honor strong moral and ethical principles of non-harming and also of benefiting others. Moreover, our values are reflected in our character, in our what fundamentally destroy or sustain our integrity. And I believe that we are a nation and a world caught in the grip of moral suffering in relation to our climate catastrophe. And as I said, many do not even realize it. But my views regarding moral suffering are related to the relationship between human greed, aversion, and ignorance, the three root poisons, and the exploitive and extractive social and corporate structures that result in pervasive, structural, and direct violence toward our earth, our atmosphere, and toward earth-cherishing peoples. And we know that the secondary cause for climate change is fossil fuel-dependent economic growth, primed by this human greed and ignorance. And we also know that fossil fuels are a finite, dangerous, dirty, and destructive source of energy. And continuing to develop fossil fuel-dependent economic growth models makes no sense whatsoever, no matter how you look at it. And as Nadegi Green of the Community Justice Project in Miami said, when resilience means money, we cannot talk about climate change without talking about economic justice. So those of us who are gathered here today are aware that we live in an interdependent world, and we know how profoundly damaging fossil fuels are to individual and collective health. And we also know that it's absolutely necessary that our global community commit to reforming our intertwined energy and economic systems. And it's really the only logical next step. And it's really the only morally sane thing to do. And yet we have to understand that we must do this from a space of courage, a space of wisdom, and a space of compassion. We also know that these wholesome, life-giving qualities are cultivated through views that are reflected in various indigenous traditions, as well as Buddhist philosophy and practice, and in other traditions, including the tradition of science. And we recognize that it's not simply about changing institutional and systemic structures. We also have to address the suffering in terms of the human heart and mind. So indigenous peoples, for example, have for millennia had a sacred and practical relationship with the earth that we need to give attention to. We are aware that the predatory process of colonization has tragically disrupted the lifeways of so many indigenous peoples, and traditional ecological knowledges acquired over thousands of years are often lost, but fortunately, not entirely. I believe that learning from indigenous peoples about ecosystem management and restoration is something we must turn to at last and now. In addition to what we've learned from Western science, so that we can dial down the impacts of an exploitive and extractive relationship with Mother Earth. I also feel that the sacredness of indigenous people's relationship to Earth reflects values that are essential to be strengthened at this time. Finally, it may seem that our climate catastrophe touches only people who are materially impoverished, or who live in coastal areas, or who are refugees fleeing climate-driven wars, but our climate devastation affects every single species on this earth and will deeply affect the coming generations. So we must act now if there is to be a viable, morally grounded, and healthy future. Like the focus of this gathering today, social engagement is essential, and so is psychospiritual transformation. We have to cultivate the qualities of heart and mind that make it possible to see the destruction we have wrought on this earth, to recognize our unacknowledged grief and shame, and also to take action to transform those habits of mind that bind us to consumerism, racism, and elitism, and blind us to the harms we have caused. So I urge us to cultivate the bodhisattva attitude, which includes this capacity to be morally sensitive in order to detect moral conflicts and dilemmas, and to also have the capacity to be able to discern what's the right thing, the morally justifiable actions that we need to take. And also to have moral nerve. This is someone who has non-negotiable virtue when standing above the abyss of harm. I want to just end this talk with good news. And that is, a few days ago, the United Nations main human rights body overwhelmingly voted to recognize the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right, and to appoint an expert to monitor human rights in the context of our climate emergency. So we can have hope, wise hope, action, active hope, engagement in order to prepare for a collective future that is one we wish to have unfold for those children and grandchildren who will be living in that world. I need to go because I'm giving another talk to people who take care of people with ALS. I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm so grateful for what you are doing.